I want to start with a story. Several years ago, an actor on a television show faced a dilemma. He was one of the biggest stars on the show, but it wasn't doing all that well in the ratings. But that wasn't the problem. This actor learned that an actress on the show, who was also a star on the show, was not being paid as much as the other male actors. Now, this actor was beloved by fans of the show, which gave him a lot of influence. So he used that influence, he went to the studio executives and used that influence to demand equal pay for this actress. And he was successful. The actress received pay equal to her male peers. The television show was Star Trek. The actor was Leonard Nimoy, who played Spock, of course, and the actress was Nichelle Nichols, who played Uhura. That's right, Leonard Nimoy believed in equal pay for equal work well before it was cool. Nimoy lent Nichols his privilege, his gender privilege as a male actor and his influence privilege with the fans. By lending her privilege, he advanced her position as an actress by giving her access to equal pay. In many ways, Leonard Nimoy was a lead developer. Although he and his fellow castmates weren't developing software, they were developing an enduring story. And what else is code but a story told by multiple people? Nimoy directly addressed the inclusion problem of the entertainment industry, but that's not the only industry that has an inclusion problem. The diversity and inclusion problems in tech are well documented. Whether it's open source or closed source, developing or deploying code, the people working in software development don't reflect the general population, nor are rewards like pay, promotions, and positions of power equally distributed. I believe that Leonard Nimoy provided a model for how everyone involved in software development can address the problem of inclusion in tech. Notice that Nimoy didn't wait for Paramount to create some diversity program, nor did he wait for some better salary policy to be handed down from his superiors. Nimoy acted, and he acted based on his sense of fairness. Nimoy lent Nichols, a fellow artist, the privilege that he had as a male actor and helped her participate in the financial benefits of his gender privilege. Also, while Nichols may not have had someone like Nimoy on the show she worked on after Star Trek, I'm sure she felt more empowered to ask for equal pay in her future roles. That's how leadership works. Leadership improves the environment of the people being led and raises the bar for what they expect from leadership. And I think that there are a number of Leonard Nimoys in this audience. And I also think that there are other ways to lend privilege, and I want to share those ways with you today. Because I think that we can all have a part to play in making technology the diverse and inclusive industry that we all want it to be. But first, we have to understand the difference between diversity and inclusion. These words are often conflated, but I think that there is an important distinction between the two. Diversity is like if you're having a party, diversity is sending invitations to your party, right? You put in the invitations in the envelope and you stamp them, and you may send some to some college buddies or a few family members or maybe some folks that you went to high school with, and that's it, you're done. Once the invitations are out, you're done. Inclusion goes further than diversity. Inclusion means that you make sure that not only are they invited to your party, but they feel welcome at your party. You understand that some people who you invited to your party had to make a longer journey than others, and so you're a little bit more welcoming to those people. Or maybe you know that some of your guests have food allergies, and so you make sure that there are other food options for those guests. Or maybe some of your guests don't drink alcohol, so you make sure that you have non-alcoholic beverages for those guests. That's being inclusive. Inclusion requires empathy, which simply means that you know that people are different. But those differences don't mean that you can disrespect them. In fact, you should respect them more because of those differences. Diversity is easy to gain with symbolic gestures and meaningless numbers, but inclusion, that takes real effort. And as Leonard Nimoy realized, inclusion won't come from corporate policy. Corporations have one function. When I was getting my MBA, this was drilled into my head. Corporations exist to deliver value to shareholders. And while many studies show that diversity and inclusion have business value, most corporations don't believe those studies. In fact, most corporations are designed in ways that inhibit inclusion. In fact, most companies put recruitment and retention in the HR department. And as a recent former worker at Uber showed through her post, the HR department does not work for the employees. The HR department works for the company that funds it and can terminate it. The HR department exists to protect the company. So tech companies won't bring the social, financial, and cultural benefit of inclusion to their employees and shareholders. It will take a grassroots movement of individual people making changes based on their sense of fairness. And that grassroots movement requires leadership. And I hope that there are a lot of leaders in this room today. And I think that there are. Now, since we work in tech, especially if you're involved in open source software, we all understand grassroots movements. One of the first books on open source software was The Cathedral and the Bazaar by Eric S. Raymond. And in this book, Raymond explored the miracle of Linux. And since most of us use Linux all the time, or we're familiar with it, we don't really remember the history. Linux was this crazy project where you had this kernel that everyone could hack at, and even though it was really complicated, they took this kernel and made a useful operating system. And it was a working operating system. And so Raymond took those principles that he saw in the development of Linux, and he wrote a book about open source development. And he had two analogies. He likened closed source development to a cathedral, where you have centralized command and control, and he compared it to open source software, where he had the analogy of a bazaar, right? This babbling bazaar that was boisterous, where power is equally distributed, but he found that that bazaar model, that crazy model, actually delivered better results. Now, the lesson that is most well known from the cathedral and the bazaar is this: given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. And maybe some of you have heard of this phrase from this book, but there's a more formal version in the book that goes like this: given a large enough beta tester and code developer base, almost every problem will be characterized quickly and the fix obvious to someone. Now, I'm sure that Eric S. Raymond may not have known this at the time, but that is a statement of an inclusion. Raymond linked the size of the code developer base, the people involved in developing software, to problem solving. And what else is innovation but the ability to solve problems? So if we let software development be this big, babbling, boisterous bazaar of people who are involved in the development of software and dedicated to making it better, then I really believe that there is no problem that we can't solve. But that nearly unlimited ability to solve problems is made possible by an inclusion. However, the sad story is that just like our repositories are protected by passwords and permissions, often our communities and our companies are protected by privilege. And there are voices that we keep out of this bazaar because we don't create a space for them. Certain groups have a hard time lending their voices to the babbling bazaar that Raymond described because they lack privilege. And this is really a tragedy, because whatever problem you have in your company, whether it's in your source code or however you ship software to your customers, there's someone out there who can fix it. But all too often, we deny access to these people. We deny entry into our teams and our projects. And to understand how this works and what we as software developers can do to make things better, we have to understand privilege. But before we do that, it's really important to understand what privilege is not. So let's say you're riding a bike up a hill, right? You're just trying to get to the top of the hill. You're working hard. You're pedaling as fast as you can. You're sweating because it's hot. You got this bad cramp in your left leg that you're dealing with, and you're trying to get up that hill. And privilege is like this. It doesn't mean you haven't sacrificed. It doesn't mean that you aren't good at what you do. But it means that there are some people who are trying to go up that hill just like you are, but they have obstacles that you don't have to deal with. You're working hard, yes, that's true, but there are certain people who have to work as hard as you do, but they have the burden of not having your privilege. And so for them, it's a harder journey because there are things that they have to deal with that you don't, things that you don't even see because you have privilege. However, having privilege does not remove the responsibility of understanding that some people don't have your privilege and that you have an obligation, I think, to do what you can to help them along their journey. Now, I'm a member of an underrepresented minority group in tech, but I do have gender privilege. And it's interesting that working as a male in tech means that I get benefits that those who don't have gender privilege lack. One of those benefits is being given the benefit of the doubt when I talk about what I do. Furthermore, if those who lack gender privilege, they often have to work harder because they encounter obstacles that I don't even think about. And for example, I often, when I'm in a new city, I just go walking. And London, it's my first time in London, actually. And London's a very walkable city. So I was walking around London, and I saw Big Ben, and I saw, of course, Buckingham Palace, and it got late, and it got dark. But I really didn't even think about it. I'm 6'2", black guy. I work out sometimes. No one's going to really attack me at 11 o'clock at night. But if I did not have my gender privilege, I probably would have gone home or to my hotel a little earlier because I would have probably had a heightened sense of danger. But gender privilege has even more severe implications inside corporate walls. Women in tech often have to constantly manage two roles at work. They have to fill the role that they were hired to fill, but they also have to fight the stereotypical role that others impose on them. It's this secondary role, the role of finding unwanted stereotypes and biases, that often makes it exhausting to be a woman who works in tech. And that's why I believe that those of us with gender privilege should lend privilege to women in tech so that they can simply do their jobs, do the jobs that they were hired to do. So now that we know what privilege is not, let's define privilege. Privilege is simply access to benefits based on traits that you possess. Those benefits could be schools, jobs, social circles, leadership roles, and wealth. And I've categorized privilege into two categories just to make it easy to split them apart. The most well-known category of privilege is what I call birth privilege. And those are the parental, racial, assigned gender, and privilege and physical privilege that you were born with. And you were born with these privileges because you got them from whatever DNA your parents gave you. And it's interesting that even though birth privilege includes things that you didn't choose for yourself, they are often the root of most bias. And it's really interesting how that works. The second category of privilege are what I call selected privilege. And those are the traits that you select for yourself. Maybe your religion, your education, your marital status. And these privileges change as we grow. Now, it's human nature, we're just built this way, to share privilege with people like us. There's just something in human nature that compels us to help those who remind us of who we are. We like people who are like us. So those of us who have gender privilege usually share our privileges with those who also have gender privilege. And if you have racial privilege, you often share the benefits of racial privilege with those who also have your racial privilege. But I think it is far more powerful to lend your privilege to those who lack your privilege. And we're going to see how that works in a few minutes. Now, the combination of your birth privileges and your selected privileges make up what I call your portfolio privileges. And this portfolio creates a set of benefits that often makes it easier for you to navigate software development and a career in tech. Now, I want everyone to look up here for a few seconds and identify at least one privilege that you have. And just think about it. Some of you have maybe one. Some of you may have all of these privileges. Now, once you have at least one privilege firmly in your mind that you have, think about what your career in software development would be if you started without those privileges. What if you started your career without your gender privilege, without your racial privilege, without the privilege of going to Stanford or MIT, or if you didn't have the ability to walk around or even see or hear? How much harder would your journey through software development be without these privileges? Now, keep in mind that there are people in tech, many of whom you work with every day, who are less privileged than you are, and they have to navigate their careers at a distinct disadvantage. Now, I think that there are ways that we can lend privilege to people who have those disadvantages, and I think that you can remove those disadvantages by lending your privilege. By spreading the benefits that you gain from your portfolio of privilege, you increase the value of everyone. Think of this as privilege diversification. Now, many of you have studied finance, and you understand that having a diverse portfolio makes that portfolio more valuable. And I think that by lending privilege, we can increase the sense of empowerment that everyone feels in software development. And I want to illustrate these three types of privilege lending by three women, and let's just call them B, L, and M, which are made-up names, but they're probably very similar to people that you work with every day. And so for each privilege category, I'm going to give an illustration of how it works. I'll describe the type of privilege, and I'll show how you can do it in your everyday work. So let's start with credibility lending. Credibility lending is providing visibility to someone without privilege. For example, LGBTQ people often feel restricted in tech because we have a very heteronormative industry. You know, we're a bunch of cisgendered folk working in software often. Those are the people you see on magazines and in articles usually. But I think that by lending credibility, you can help our LGBTQ fellow technologists be a little bit less hindered in tech. So here's the example. Several years ago, DeRay McKesson visited the Colbert Show when it was around. So Stephen Colbert invited DeRay to come in, and Stephen Colbert switched seats with DeRay, and that demonstrated credibility lending. DeRay gained the powerful platform of Colbert's chair, which raised his profile. And that's how credibility lending works. So let's say you work with B, and you love B. She developed that killer feature in the last release. She's always active in your team's Slack channels, helping new members and explaining different decisions. And she may have a really good grasp of the architecture, so she always is diving in to understand, well, that's why we do this, because we architected it this way. And she's been a solid member of your development team for a long time. But most of the senior leaders in your company don't even know her name. So why don't you lend her credibility by inviting B to the next board meeting and letting her present that feature to the company? Why don't you, by doing that, you can raise her profile in your company and give her access to more opportunity. So that's credibility lending. That's credibility lending. Access lending, the second type of lending privilege, is providing entry to someone without privilege. And I work with a lot of women in tech, and I've been fortunate to do that because I believe that women offer tremendous value in tech. But my fellow colleagues who happen to be women often describe that they experience sexism because they lack gender privilege. And ironically, even though women are such a strong part of every technical team I've ever worked on, This lack of gender privilege often causes women to doubt their abilities, which is, I think, tragic. But I think that access lending can be a powerful way to fix this. So here's the example. Tracy Chow, who is a well-known inclusion activist in tech, once told the story of how one of her Stanford professors asked her to be a TA. And this was at Stanford, so she was in the computer science program, and she was struggling. And she's like, you want me to be a TA? I'm having a hard time with these classes, and all the male students seem to be breezing through the classes, saying, oh, that lab was easy, and I aced that quiz, it was no problem. But the professor was insistent, and so Tracy said, okay, I'll be a TA. Well, by becoming a TA, Tracy had access to the grades of those male students, and she realized they weren't doing all that better than she was. And so she gained more confidence in her abilities because she saw that I can be successful here. None of these male students are better than me. In fact, I may be doing better than them in certain areas. So how can this work at your company? Let's say that you know that Elle spent the last month at your company implementing your container strategy. She's really sharp, she can always answer your questions, and she's always available to help solve problems. Why not lend her access by sending her to that Docker conference that always invites you to speak? Because you're a hotshot speaker on the tech circuit. You're always being invited to speak at places. Why not let her go? You don't even do Docker. You can't even spell Docker. Why should you go? Why don't you let Elle go? And by doing that, you will help her see that she too has a place at tech events. Expertise lending is providing a voice to someone without privilege. People of color often feel that we don't have a voice in tech companies, because we lack the racial privilege that most tech leaders possess. And I think that expertise lending can help fix this. Our former First Lady was at South by Southwest, which is going on now in Austin, but last year she gave a keynote at the music festival. And I saw her husband give the keynote at Interactive, which was an awesome experience. But former First Lady Michelle Obama said something really interesting during her keynote. She said, if you got a voice at the table, ask, is there diversity around the table? Are there voices and opinions that don't sound like yours? That's a great description of expertise lending. And you can practice this by giving M, who's one of your best developers, the opportunity to be the lead on your next project. After all, she's made it her mission to convert your front end to Angular. She spent a lot of late nights figuring that out. And by letting her lead, you give her a chance to lend her voice to your company. Now, those are 3 types of privilege lending, and it's really easy to do. And in fact, I hope that you've thought of other ways that in other types of privileges while I've been speaking. But lending privilege isn't a silver bullet. It's not something that you try once, you say, well, it didn't work, I'm moving on to something else. You have to really buy into it. Lending privilege has to be a philosophy of life. You have to believe in the bizarre that Eric Raymond described, and really believe that there's a benefit to having truly inclusive technology teams. Last year, I gave this talk at a conference that had Common perform. And everyone know the rapper Common? I don't know, that might be my black privilege that I know who Common is. Very famous rapper, and he gave a benefit concert for Black Girls Code, which is a very popular and I support a lot mission group. And so Common's known for a number of hit songs, but one of my favorite songs is one he did for a movie called Selma that came out a couple years ago now. And it's called Glory, and he wrote it with John Legend, and the chorus for Glory goes like this. One day, when the glory comes, it will be ours. It will be ours. And that song captures the essence of why I think that diversity and inclusion in software is so important. When we have a diverse and inclusive technology industry, it won't mean that women win or that gay people win or transgender people win or black people win. It means that we all win. And we see this in every movement in our nation's history to advance the rights of the disenfranchised. Several months ago, a brave Muslim American father famously offered to lend his copy of the Constitution to a politician. The ACLU offered to send free copies of the Constitution to anyone who made a request. So I made my request, and I got my copy of the Constitution. And since I'm in England, I should say that we owe you a debt because you guys had the Magna Carta, which the founding fathers borrowed heavily from. I'm not sure the Magna Carta had a Creative Commons license, but I thought I'd give it some attribution. But as I read the Constitution, I was like, you know what? This document holds up pretty well. And I saw that the founders did add innovation in that they implemented a pull request system into the Constitution. And so you can propose changes. They're called amendments. And then you can have them reviewed and possibly merged back in. And it's kind of a messy process. It's only been done about 27 times in 200 years. So it's not very pleasant, but it works. And just like in software development, the first version of the Constitution had some problems, but you see a lot of information in these pull requests, in these amendments. For example, when the 13th Amendment to the Constitution was passed after the turmoil of the Civil War, a lot of people think that it outlawed enslaving black people. And it did that, but it went further than that. The 13th Amendment made it impossible to not just own black people, but it made it illegal to own anyone. So as the descendant of black slaves, I'm sure that my ancestors rejoiced at that amendment, but all Americans should have celebrated because they now lived in a country where everyone was truly free. And when the 17th Amendment gave women the right to vote, I'm sure that a lot of women in the country celebrated being let into the franchise, but all Americans won because they no longer lived in a country that held their gender against someone at the ballot box. And going away from the amendments, when the Supreme Court ruled a couple of years ago that same-sex marriage was simply marriage and therefore illegal, I'm sure a lot of LGBTQ people celebrated, but we all won because we now lived in a country that did not put restrictions on who you could love. Now, as a nation, we've tried to form a more perfect union by addressing the wrongs done to people of color, women, and LGBTQ people. And I think that we can form a more perfect software industry by addressing our own peculiar problems. When we take the lead in making software development a place where everyone is welcome, no matter who you are, we all win because we will work in an industry that puts no limits on talent. One day, when the glory comes, it will be ours. It will be ours. Now, I know we all want to make our mark on tech. We all want to make our mark on pull requests and commits and lines of code. But I think if we want to truly make our mark in software development, then lending privilege is a powerful way to do it. Long after the code that we make is decommissioned and the people that we work with move on to other projects, the privilege we share can bring lasting change to our industry. Now, I know that some of you may be unconvinced. Maybe say, you know what, I just came to QCon to learn how to write code. I just wanted to learn more techniques for maybe refactoring or different techniques for doing code reviews, and all that's good. But I think that, yeah, you may think that building software has nothing to do with diversity and inclusion, but I don't have any proof. But I think that when Leonard Nimoy went into the offices of the studio executives, that some of them wondered, what does making a sci-fi TV show have to do with paying a black actress? And I think that if Leonard Nimoy was posed that question, he would say it has everything to do with making a sci-fi TV show. Because I have to believe that the man who symbolized the power of infinite diversity and infinite combinations had to believe that there's power in creating an environment where everyone is equally rewarded for bringing their ideas, their talents, their perspectives, and their passions to making software. So if we want women, people of color, LGBTQ people, and other marginalized groups to not only come in technology, but stay and get promoted, if we want that boisterous bazaar where no bug is deep, then I think that we all have a role to play by lending our privilege. Thank you. And I think I have some time for Q&A, so fire away. Jason, yes?
Hi. Can you give some examples of where the corporate structure, rather than the people within it, that the corporate structure works against inclusion?
Yeah, I think that, I gave one example of how a lot of HR departments are put in place and given the semblance of, HR stands for human resources, right? It seems by its name to serve human resources, serve people. And so a lot of people come to HR when they may have experienced a microaggression, or they may feel like I'm not being promoted where other people are, and I think that might be because of my race or my gender. And HR department is structurally created to really protect the organization. We all heard about the former engineer at Uber who wrote a story about her experience. And that showed, that article showed that Uber, and don't want to, badmouth Uber all that much, because it's not that different from other companies, it's just structurally not made to address that problem. And I think that there are other examples of how companies like Uber structurally aren't created, and you see it in HR departments. They're not designed to really help people who would come with a complaint because they're designed to protect the company, right? One other way that companies aren't structurally made to be inclusive is you see it in job descriptions. And a lot of job descriptions are written by people who are usually men, and they're worded in a way that often, women may find not as, they may doubt their ability to fit that description. There was a couple of studies that showed that, and I don't remember the exact numbers, but if a man will read a job description, and let's say there are, 10 qualifications, a man will see, oh, I meet 3, I'll apply. A woman would usually want to meet 8 or 9, right? And that's just simply a difference in how genders view opportunity. So by writing those job descriptions in a way, and usually putting bullet points, making it very clear, and being very, very specific in why this requirement is for the job, you can increase the number of women who apply. And there are lots of articles that show how to write better job descriptions. So again, that's one way that corporations are structured. And I'm not even saying that this is something that's done on purpose, but whether it's intentional or not, the results are clear. There are a number of articles on how you can improve even how you write job descriptions that you post to work at your company that will encourage more women to apply. So those are 2 examples of how structurally a lot of companies aren't up to the task. And I think that there are many resources that are available to do this if companies would really show interest in this problem. And again, I think corporations are coming around, and there's been, the Uber example was a recent illustration of some of the problems of why technology can often be a very unwelcoming place for women especially, but I think for other groups. But I think it's us. I think that the people in this room, by little small changes in how we see the world, by just being aware that people go through tech and their journey is impeded simply because of their gender. I mean, how crazy is that? If we went to an alien planet and you saw that people with green eyes were discriminated against and couldn't work, and but people with other eye colors could, we would think that's crazy. I mean, there's a Star Trek episode on this, right? I mean, they're like, why is this, half the body's this way and they're treated some way, and then half the body's a certain color. And that was meant to address that, race and the way, especially race, but also gender, these are all social constructs. These are all things that people made up to hinder certain groups. And, if we made it up, then we can change it. So I hope that answers your question. Anything else? In the back, right there.
You mentioned selected privilege.
Yes.
Could you give a few examples of that? I couldn't miss it. Did you say there was religion, obviously?
Yeah. So, and some may argue that you don't choose your religion, right? Your parents usually give you one, but I think you have to buy into it. So, in America, if you are a member of the Judeo-Christian, group, you usually have privileges. I mean, you're not stopped at the border, for example, right? But if you're a Muslim, then that's often held against you. And so, that's one example of how a selected privilege like religion gives you access and to certain advantages and also from certain restrictions that someone who did not choose that religion, will have to experience, right? Does that make sense?
It does, but I was looking for other examples of privilege as well.
Education's one, right? So if you choose to go to, Harvard, then not only, well, one, normally you have to have the finances and, ideally someone in your family who went, that helps a lot. And so by going to Harvard, then you get access to usually, better jobs. You get access to social circles. You're a Harvard person. And so that's a selected privilege that you're not born with, but by selecting it, you get advantages. So, and there are a lot of other selected privileges, but those are two obvious ones. Yes?
Is there any way to make people who have a lot of privilege feel empathy because they haven't experienced this themselves?
Yeah. Yeah, the way that I usually try to help people who have privilege, and I'm on my own journey, and I know that my privileges, especially being a male in tech, I'm still learning how that is really an unfair advantage. I've had colleagues or know people who, are better technologists than I am, but they're not as far as I've been able to get. I think a lot of it is because I have male privilege, right? I've worked hard, but there are times when I think that, my male privilege is, really an unfair advantage, and they are often unfairly penalized for not having it. But the way that I try to help people understand having privilege is we all know someone probably in our families or in our friends who may have struggled with something, right? Maybe they got addicted to prescription pills and they happen to get arrested for that. And so they may have often that's a felony. And these people often have trouble getting jobs. And they're falling into this situation where they're struggling because of their addiction. Or anytime that you get arrested, and most people know someone who's been through the legal system. And so the same sympathy that you have for this person, you're like, man, this person had just a bad run of luck, of bad luck, and I really feel bad that they can't get a job or they're ostracized in some other way. Well, there are people who didn't commit a crime, but simply because of their gender or their race, they have the same limitations. So the same way that you can relate and care about someone who's in that situation, hopefully you can have empathy for people who have the same restrictions but not the same predicament. Does that make sense? That's how I explain it. Yes?
Yeah, so you've given some really good examples of how you can help them privilege to essentially colleagues, people you're working with.
Right.
But one of the privileges you have is kind of like you're in a tech company working. Do you have any ideas of how to kind of encourage more diversity coming in so that we have these opportunities to learn privilege?
Yes, I think that if I understand your question, how can you, working in a technology company, use the linear privilege concept to make the company more inclusive? I think that there are a couple ways. One, and often people work at different levels, whether you're junior developer or senior developer or team lead or manager or vice president. So obviously the higher up you are in the org structure, the more influence you have. But I think that everyone can have a conversation, maybe at your next one-on-one or maybe at your annual review, or if you have an all-hands meeting, have your company comes together and just have the conversation and say, how do we write job descriptions for companies? Who's writing the job description? Is it all men? Is it all a certain demographic group? And have we thought about how we write them? And let's Google this cool thing called Google ways that we can create better job descriptions, or not only that, and I'm talking about the selection process, right, from posting the job to bringing in candidates to screening them, maybe a phone screen, then bringing them in and then doing the offer. How do we do that? Do we remove all identifying information and try to do like a blind review of the resume? That's not, because often just by looking at the name of the person, it happens almost instantly. You almost subconsciously have biases that you apply to it. Can we try doing that? Maybe remove the name and where they went to school. Let's look at their qualifications. How can we become a little bit more neutral when it comes to biases by doing that? And just make the suggestion and say, hey, I'll volunteer to help lead that effort. I'll volunteer to spend a month, maybe a couple months involved with our selection process. I'll work with HR and try it, right? And so and I have to tell people, just start small, right? I mean, looking over resumes or helping out in writing job descriptions, that's something that you can do hopefully in your spare time. But it can go a long way toward helping your company move toward being more inclusive. So, and I always try to show people, really the key thing is being aware that people often that work right next to you are going through things that you can safely ignore because of your privilege. But by taking awareness, you should transition to action. Okay, how I'm aware of this, and maybe I can enhance my awareness by going out for tea, for coffee with certain people and say, hey, I've been wondering about, how's this going with you in this company? And it takes time to build that trust, so it won't happen the first or second time. But as you become more aware, you'll find ways to act. So, yeah, but start small. And always come from the position of empathy. I think someone was asking about empathy. Always come from a stance of empathy. Anyone else? I thought I saw another hand over here. No? Okay. That's my time. Thank you.